Hi everyone, and welcome to your first week of remote learning. For our first unit, we are going to be focusing on short stories. And so this video is going to go through the elements of a short story. As you watch this video, since you're watching at home, you can watch it as many times as you want. I don't think you need to take notes. You certainly can if you want to. Feel free to pause the video at any time to jot things down. I'm also going to attach the actual presentation that I'm using if you want to kind of keep a copy of that and look through that at any time. So I'm going to walk you through the elements of a short story now, and this will get us set up for the first several weeks of our remote learning. So, what is a short story? A short story is a brief imaginative narrative that contains a few characters, a very simple plot, usually one conflict, some suspense, which is going to lead to a climax, and a swift conclusion. Short stories are short because they can be read in one sitting. And generally because they're so short, they tend to be much simpler than our novels. We don't see a lot of characters. We don't see a lot of different conflicts. We usually see one conflict. We usually see like less than 5 characters. So they tend to be much simpler in terms of that. The 4 main elements of a short story are the plot, setting, character, and theme. And now we're going to look a little bit more closely at each of these elements. So our first element is plot. Plot is the chain of events in a story, and there are 6 main ingredients to plot. First, we have our introduction and exposition. Then we have the inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. So most of these are probably, you've heard of these before. This is all review. This should not be new information. But I'm going to go through each element of plot and just kind of work through them just as a reminder of what each element of plot looks like. Before I do that, though, I'm going to show you the plot diagram. So this is a plot diagram. Again, nothing new here. We've all seen this before. It's just a good way to kind of lay out the plot of the story. We see the exposition, the inciting incident, or the conflict that sparks the rising action. That's where the characters are kind of wrestling with the conflict and trying to solve the problem and maybe making some attempts and failing. The climax, that's going to be our height of action or emotion. And then the falling action and resolution, that's where the main conflict is being resolved, and then the resolution, all the loose ends have been tied up. One thing I do want to mention about the plot diagram is as it's drawn here, it makes it seem like, that there's an equal amount of time spent on the first part of the pyramid and the second part of the pyramid. So there's an equal amount of time on the exposition, rising action, and climax as there is spent on the falling action and resolution. And that's not actually accurate. Most short stories tend to be a lot more lopsided than this diagram depicts. So authors tend to spend a lot more time in the exposition and rising action portion of the story than they do in the falling action and resolution. Sometimes a falling action and resolution can be just 1 or 2 sentences in a short story. So don't be alarmed if when you're reading and you're thinking about plot, if you're thinking, man, I feel like we're still in the rising action, but I only have like 2 paragraphs left. That's okay. That's totally normal. You wouldn't expect to see an equal amount of time spent on both. So don't worry about that. That's normal. And you, in fact, will most of the time you will see fairly lopsided pyramids in your plot diagram. Okay, so let's look at the introduction. The introduction is used to introduce the reader to setting, so where the story is taking place. It'll give the reader some background information of the basic situation in the story. It'll give you the characters involved, and it may or may not have a narrative hook. A narrative hook is a question or statement that grabs the reader's attention. The next aspect of plot is the inciting incident. So the inciting incident is the first major action piece in the story, and it sets the story in motion, gets the ball rolling. So in the short story, The Lottery Ticket, that we're going to read first, the inciting incident is when the main character discovers that his wife's lottery ticket, the first 4 numbers of it have been printed in the paper. And that's kind of what gets the ball rolling in terms of the conflict and sets up the main conflict in the story. So speaking of conflict, conflict is what prevents the main character from getting what he or she wants. Keep in mind, the plot is driven by the conflict, especially in a short story. The conflict is the most important feature of the story. Conflict is what keeps the story interesting. If you don't have a conflict in a story, then all you have is like a list of things that happened. There's nothing interesting to keep the reader's attention without a conflict. So what separates a story from someone's to-do list or laundry list of items is conflict. So keep in mind, conflict is an integral piece of the story. And we have two types of conflict. We have internal and external conflict. So there's only one type of internal conflict, and that is man versus self. So that is when a character is experiencing some sort of crisis of conscience. Maybe they're wondering, do I watch TV or do I do my homework? That would be an internal conflict. If a character has a tough decision to make in some arena or area, that can be an internal conflict. And those are always going to be man versus self. Moving into external conflict, probably the most obvious type of external conflict we see is man versus man. And that's where we have two characters that are butting heads over something. Generally, it's going to be, in a short story between the protagonist and the antagonist. So that's a man versus man conflict. Pretty straightforward there. Two characters that are having a problem of some sort in a short story. Another type of external conflict we see is man versus society. I put up Lois Lowry's The Giver book cover because if you've read The Giver, or even if you haven't, the main character, Jonah, lives in a dystopian society, and he finds out some information about the society and realizes that he is in conflict with that new information now, puts him in conflict with the society, and he doesn't want to go along with the society anymore. And so he has to make a decision as to what he's going to do. Is he going to stay in the dystopian society, or is he going to leave? So that would be an example of man versus society, but it's when the character conflicts with the society at large. So that could be rules or government at the place where the character is living. Another type of external conflict is man versus the environment. I put up a picture from Life of Pi, the movie. It's also a great book. If you've read it or watched the movie, the movie has beautiful graphics. But the conflict, there's a lot of man versus the environment conflicts. The main character is shipwrecked, so a storm could be a type of conflict that we see in man versus the environment. So he's shipwrecked in a storm, then he's lost at sea. Another man versus the environment conflict. He has to survive, alone at sea. He's also in a small dinghy with a tiger, a wild tiger. That would be another man versus the environment conflict because we have, a wild animal that kind of counts as man versus the environment. Sometimes we hear this said as man versus nature. So that's another type of external conflict. Man versus fate. I've got two examples here. We all read Things Fall Apart with Chinua Achebe's main character, Okonkwo. We know he has a struggle with his fate. He very much wants to be a leader in his society. He wants to be one of the top chief elders in his society, but his fate has other plans for him. And so that would be a man versus fate kind of conflict. I also have a picture from Lord of the Rings. If you've read the books or if you've seen the movie trilogy, the main character, or one of the main characters, Bilbo Baggins, is tasked to destroy this ring, one ring to rule them all. And he at first refuses the task. He does not want to have anything to do with this ring. And no matter what he does, the ring keeps finding him and he ends up having to be the one to go destroy it. So that would be another example of man versus fate. Man versus technology, that could be any type of conflict with robots, or even a conflict with your computer not working, or a cell phone issue. So if you've seen the movie I, Robot with Will Smith, it's about robots that kind of take over the world. So that would be an example of a man versus technology conflict. Man versus the supernatural. So the supernatural is kind of a large umbrella. It could be, a character versus ghosts, like we see in Ghostbusters. It could be supernatural, as in superheroes. It could be man versus like a higher power of some sort. But that would be man versus the supernatural. Okay, our next piece of plot in the plot diagram is the rising action. So the rising action is where incidents happen that carry the plot along. So within rising action, we might see foreshadowing, we might see flashback, conflict, and suspense. So just a quick review. Foreshadowing is a technique for hinting at events that may occur later in the plot. Flashback is the insertion of an earlier event in the timeline of the narrative. Suspense is the feeling of excitement or curiosity that keeps the reader turning the pages. So it's created by making the readers wonder how a conflict will be resolved. Next in plot, we have climax. This is the highest point of interest in the story, where the character solves his or her problems. Usually it's the highest point of emotion. The climax, the incident that is the climax in the story, this can be subjective, meaning there might be different answers. People will have different opinions about this. So whenever you're talking about climax, it's important to prove your answer choice with textual evidence. Okay, next in the plot diagram is the falling action. This is where the character completes the action of his or her decision that he or she made in the climax. Whoops, sorry about that. And then finally, the resolution. That is the final workings of a story's conflict. All the loose ends are tied up, usually. Sometimes there's a narrative twist, which could be a surprise ending. Okay, second element of plot is the setting. That is the time and place in which a story occurs. So time meaning time of day, season, past, present, future. Location could mean country, planet, town, building. Usually in the setting, there's going to be a description of the surroundings, and the setting is used to help create the mood and the atmosphere of the text. So atmosphere or mood is the feeling that the setting evokes. So is it mysterious? Is it happy? Is it eerie? It is not the mood of the characters. It's important to note. Speaking of characters, characters are any personalities who are involved in the plot of the story. They could be people, animals, fantasy characters, anybody. Usually in a short story, we're going to have less than 6. You will generally have a protagonist, that's the main character that we follow, and the character that kind of is tasked with solving the conflict of the story. The antagonist will be the bad guy or villain in the story. Sometimes the bad guy is, or the villain is, the antagonist is the person that creates conflict for the main character. Secondary characters are other characters who are necessary to move the plot along, but they may not be involved in the central conflict. And often secondary characters aren't going to be super dynamic. They're not going to change a lot throughout the story. Just a quick note on characterization and character traits. Physical and personality characteristics are revealed through what the character does, what the character says, what other characters say or do about the character, what the author directly states, and what the author implies. And then finally, we have theme. Theme is the central idea about life that the story highlights. It's the overall message. It creates universal truths. It is the message that the author is conveying. So to determine theme, you can look at the conflicts in the story, decide what side of the conflict the story represents or where you think the author falls in terms of the conflict, and look at how the conflict is resolved. Who wins? Who loses? That can help you determine theme. Remember, theme is not the moral of the story, and theme is not a plot. We're going to talk more about theme later in next week. But for now, that was your short story elements review. Please feel free to email me or send me a message and remind if you have any questions.